start the keynote speech. All participants, please take a seat. I am the moderator of this keynote speech. I am Young Lee. I'm teaching in 경희 University English Literature and Cultural Studies, and also a member of the Center for Cultural Studies, which is hosting this wonderful conference. Thank you for everyone who has come here to hear and discuss about a heavy and very serious topic on this beautiful Saturday afternoon. The overall theme of this whole conference is critical thinking of global authoritarianism that is emerging around the world today, and the search for alternatives, whether it's utopia or not. Today's keynote speech discusses the role of literature in theorizing authoritarianism in global South. It is her position, I think, that a full understanding of global authoritarianism can only be reached by addressing the rise of authoritarianism in non-Western, non-European regions, especially linked to the flavor of the anti-colonial movement. The keynote speaker today is a well-known, world-famous scholar who has been doing research on this topic for a long time. I am very honored and pleased to introduce Professor Yovita Goya. Before welcoming her, I would like to introduce a little bit more about her. Professor Yovita Goya is a professor of African American Studies and English at UCLA, USA, and she's the author of books. The title is Romance, Diaspora, and Black Atlantic, which was published Black Atlantic Literature, published in 2010. And also the other book, Runaway Journals, The Global Afterlives of Slavery, which was published 2019, 4 years ago. This book has won many, many prizes, 3 prizes, wonderful, amazing achievements. This book won the Rene Wallet Prize from ACLA, the Perkins Prize from the International Society for the Study of Narrative, and also honorable mention for the James Russell Lowell Prize from MLA. This great achievement, I think. Yeah. She has published widely on African diasporas, post-colonial and U.S. literature, and she also edited a number of volumes and journals. And she also is the recipient of the Abbey Award for the Art of Teaching, USLA's highest distinguished teaching award. Fellowships from NEH, ACLS, and the U.S. President Office, and has served as the president of ASAP. ASAP is the Association for the Study of the Art of the President. This is a wonderful organization. So the whole session will last 50 minutes. We delayed 15 minutes. So we will start at 1:15 and it will end 2:05. So she will have maybe 40 minutes lecture, and we will have 10 minutes with responses or discussions or some challenges from the floor. And please welcome Professor Yovita Goya.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, and thank you everyone for rushing through your lunch to make it to this session. I'd also like to begin by thanking, as everyone has done, CCS, Icctp, and Kyunghee University. I'd also like to just say how much pleasure I've had in reconnecting with ATN folks after such a long break because of the pandemic, and I'm really excited to share my work with you today. So my talk is called Failed States, Failed Genres. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes? Okay, great. That literature has a long history of theorizing authoritarianism, especially in the global south, is now a truism. After all, what has come to be called the dictator novel is a mainstay in Latin American and African literature, testifying to the value of imaginative retellings of submerged or distorted histories of torture, disappearance, detention, and state-sanctioned genocide. The charge of truth and reconciliation commissions across the globe has been accompanied by a ferocious body of work on memory, haunting, witnessing, guilt, confession, and healing. And here we could think of works by any number of writers. I've just listed a few here: Nuruddin Farah, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Ousmane Sembène, Chinua Achebe, and so on, to name just a few. Often focusing on the grotesque or obscene mind and body of the dictator, such fictions cut him down to size, using parody, farce, and exaggeration to highlight what Achille Mbembe has called the aesthetics of vulgarity. Often calling on the affordances of magic realism, writers also emphasize historical recovery through archival mining, self-reflexively troubling the boundaries between fact and fiction, history and narrative. Whether revealing the links between authoritarianism and patriarchy, exposing the power of global financial regimes and imperialist military interventions, or unearthing the structural causes and effects of dictatorial rule, such fiction has a prophetic purpose, a forensic function, and a memorial occasion. In The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, an account of the unfolding generational trauma inflicted by the Rafael Trujillo regime in the Dominican Republic, Junot Diaz goes so far as to jokingly assert a kinship among authors and authoritarians. He writes, "What is it with dictators and writers anyway? Since before the infamous Caesar-Ovid War, they've had beef. Rushdie claims that tyrants and scribblers are natural antagonists, but I think that's too simple. It lets writers off pretty easy. Dictators, in my opinion, just know competition when they see it. Same with writers. Like, after all, recognizes like." Diaz, of course, is thinking about the powers of imaginative world-making, changing minds, rewriting histories, and controlling the audience's experience of truth that unites dictators and writers. He further reminds us that every dictator is also a consummate storyteller. So I run the risk of reading his snark too seriously when I say that this suggestion of a kinship between the kind of control authors seek and dictators enforce goes against most conventional arguments about the relation between literature and human rights. Numerous scholars have insisted on the ability of literature to equip us to recognize authoritarianism and to imagine new forms of restorative justice. But as a literary scholar, especially focused on the contemporary period in the African diaspora, I've become increasingly impatient with the claim that reading literature enables and expands empathy, a truism that neither attends to the increasingly complex dynamics of literary readership and its diverse publics, nor to the narrative technologies that invite or repel cathexis. Looking to create a more nimble account of the short 20th century and its unfolding aftermath today, I want to turn to two historical scenes to try and generate a more unsettled and unsettling account of what literature can achieve in the face of rising authoritarian power. The first is mid-20th century Kenya, where, as Caroline Elkins's Imperial Reckoning shows, the last days of British colonialism were characterized by the widespread detention, torture, and murder of thousands of Gikuyu people under the guise of attacking Mau Mau savagery and witchcraft. And I won't have a lot of time to go into this, but I look at it in my larger project. The Mau Mau uprising, of course, from 1952 to 1960 has been at the center of various kinds of battles for representation from that period to this day. And I'm just going to give you two very quick examples where you can see the difference in how the movement and the uprising was portrayed. The one on the left, at least on my left, is creating this kind of prefiguring a kind of blaxploitation themed occasion of frenzied terrorists, naked terror, and so on. And on the right side, as you can see, the Mau Mau War Veterans Association is restoring focus on the question of land and freedom. This is another example of a movie that came out in 1955 in the United States, directed by Elwood Price, that you can sort of see from the poster the kinds of things that it's doing in making us think about what the Mau Mau movement really was, a particular kind of representation of anti-colonial politics. My second historical scene is post-colonial Zimbabwe, ruled by Robert Mugabe, as we know, until the ripe old age of 93, the archetype for the despot who refused to step down from power after a failed program of land reclamation from white settlers, leading to hyperinflation and massive economic and political turmoil. Both historical flashpoints require us to return to the question of the historical failure of anti-colonialism, without which we cannot hope to fathom the nature of authoritarianism in the post-colony or to assess the work of post-colonial literature today. So in the first part of this talk, I try to rethink failure. In the second, I turn to a play that theorizes the meaning of anti-colonial revolution in mid-20th century Africa. And in the final section, I turn to an anatomy of the failure of national liberation and the rise of dictatorships in contemporary Zimbabwe. Perhaps the most influential account of the failure of decolonization is anthropologist David Scott's lament that, quote, anti-colonial utopias have gradually withered into post-colonial nightmares. When the bankruptcy of post-colonial regimes is palpable in the extreme, Scott writes, in other words, when the potential of radical nationalism, socialism, and revolutionary transformations is exhausted, how can we not conclude that, like Hamlet, our time is out of joint? That is to say, the failure of mid-20th century decolonization to reverse colonial plunder, to redeem a collective past, and to plot a livable future weighs down our present conjuncture with the burden of unrealized hopes and the dread of impending doom. I want to push back against what I think is a widespread tendency to conflate the historical failure of national liberation to bring about social and economic transformation with the failure of post-colonial theory to grasp past, present, and future forms of empire. The dominant critical trap today is this allure of narratives of failure. And while current critical fascination with the failure of decolonization comes from a different conceptual vocabulary, I worry that it echoes the deeply flawed discourse around failed states that gained currency in the wake of 1989. Labels like failed state index, recently renamed fragile state index, only anoint the West as the norm from which the post-colony is destined to deviate, frozen in Manichaean opposition to an equally static first world. I don't minimize the profound failure of the post-colonial nation state, but I'm troubled by rhetoric that conflates the failure of the nation as a container for hope, the failure of decolonization movements in the Black Atlantic world as a politics, and the failure of post-colonial studies as a field. This is where it's helpful to recall Anne Stoller's suggestion that political concepts both conceal the scenes of their making and intervene in the allocation of power. She thus invites us to contest the naturalization of the noun colony to the extent that it does not seem like a political concept at all, and to further theorize its persistence into the present. Accordingly, we need to assess the status of anti-colonial thought and its expansive reach into our catastrophic present at a moment when decolonization is becoming a watchword for many distinct communities. To do so, I turn to Scott precisely because he insists on the fundamental difference between the two problem spaces, the freedom-seeking movements and thinkers of the mid-20th century and the tragic, dispirited post-colonial present. And so he insists, this is Scott, we need to give up constructing an image of colonialism that demands from us an attitude of anti-colonial longing, a longing for anti-colonial revolution. This is precisely the spirit that has returned with a vengeance today, some 20 years later, an attitude of anti-colonial longing, a longing for anti-colonial revolution in recent celebrated African diaspora novels like Noviolet Bulawayo's Glory, Maza Mengiste's The Shadow King, and Imbolo Mwe's How Beautiful We Were, rescripting the fates of Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, and Cameroon, respectively. Such fictions are anatomies of the dictatorships that followed decolonization, but perhaps counterintuitively, they do not abandon the politics of national liberation, but revive them for the 21st century. Scott's argument hinges on a virtuosic reading of C.L.R. James's monumental study of the Haitian Revolution, The Black Jacobins. James's Toussaint, for Scott, is not Caliban, but Hamlet. Again, these are Scott's words, a modernist intellectual suffering, like Hamlet, the modern fracturing of thought and action. Scott resists anti-colonial stories plotted as a romance, narratives of overcoming, salvation, redemption, where history rides a triumphant and seamlessly progressive rhythm. In contrast, tragedy does not conceive of past, present, and future as, quote, moments of epic succession. They do not line up neatly as though history were heading somewhere, from bondage to freedom, from despair to triumph. While romance assumes, again, these are Scott's words, that, quote, we are masters and mistresses of our destiny, that our pasts can be left behind and new futures leaped into, end quote, tragedy reckons with forces beyond our control, with vulnerability, chance, and contingency. For me, quarreling with the assumption that romance is redemptive while tragedy is remorseless enables a different relationship between the anti-colonial and the post-colonial conjunctures, where the unfinished quest for decolonization can indeed continue to animate our visions of futurity and expand our understanding of anti-colonial genres, the manifesto or memoir, elegy or allegory, satire or farce. Particularly in post-colonial studies, debates about nation as narration, the national longing for form, and third world literature as national allegory have been foundational, calling attention to the inextricable link between the individual and the larger collective. The novel as a genre has always occupied pride of place in such discussions, as its specific alliance with modernity, its ability to stage interiority and psychological depth, and its history of amalgamating borrowed forms unavoidably linked it to national liberation and its disappointments. And I always think of George Lamming in this context, when in The Pleasures of Exile, he lists the three most important events in Anglophone Caribbean history. One, the so-called discovery by Columbus. Two, the end of slavery and the influx of Indian and Chinese labor. And three, these are his words, the discovery of the novel by West Indians as a way of projecting the inner experiences of the West Indian community, right? So a very small claim for the novel there. I want to take seriously the possibility that the contemporary African diaspora novel continues to provide a space for the exploration of intricate inner lives, for analysis of social and economic transitions, for new cartographies of self and other. I've written elsewhere about the many transformations of romance in Black Atlantic thought, transformations that interrupt the temporality of redemption. Conceptions of diaspora that reckon with loss and fracture often conceive of the relation between past, present, and future differently, as diaspora time can be recursive and messianic, but it can also be characterized by rupture or by imagined simultaneities. The work of cultural reconstruction, remembrance, or repair doesn't always take place in linear fashion or involve nostalgia and idealization alone. If we don't assume that genres are transhistorical entities, not just a kind of shorthand, but are about participation in a collective initiative, if they enable recognition, they can reframe our horizons of meaning and dreaming, paving our paths to political knowledge. Thinking of genre as epistemology allows us to see patterns of thinking emerge across space and time, to glean how history is sedimented in these patterns, and to imagine alternatives to the pervasive rhetoric of failure. In an era when all that is certain is the coming disaster, perhaps the romance of anti-colonial revolution could indeed remain generative. Black Jacobins famously revisit stories of the failure of slave revolts, teaching us that Toussaint's failure was the failure of enlightenment, not of darkness. And as Rachel Douglas recently argues, James's many instances of writing and rewriting his account of the Haitian Revolution encapsulate the very dynamic of revolutionary process. The book is unfinished and provisional. It can never be finished, like the revolution itself. The much wider archive of anti-colonial writing similarly writes and rewrites the meaning of success and failure, making it imperative for us to revisit how today's world has been shaped by that seismic mid-century cataclysm, still poorly absorbed into our historical consciousness. Any number of works from that era are subsequently seen as prescient. We could think of Fanon, Richard Wright, Achebe, Ngugi, Soyinka, Arma, Aidu. The failure of African political leadership in the era of nation building is a twice-told tale. But when we turn to something like the South African writer Peter Abrams' stunning series of novels about Pan-Africanism and national liberation, we find something of value that exceeds the diagnosis of failure, the awareness of tragedy, or the hymn of despair. Similarly, the many returns to the martyred figure of Patrice Lumumba, from Says There Is a Season in the Congo, to Adrienne Kennedy's Funny House of a Negro from 1964, to Raoul Peck's documentaries, these have purposes other than the prophecy of failure. Not only do such works invite us to assess anti-colonial revolutions from the horizon of their eventual success, they variously excavate the complex causes of failure, attributing it either to the cultural tendencies of a people, or to global dynamics of resource extraction, or to the logic of dependency. For Abrams in Wreath for Udomo and for Wright in Black Power, for example, tribalism remains the greatest threat to African independence, and forced modernization the remedy. In contrast, abstractionist or experimental meditations like those of Kennedy probe the very meaning of human life and the absurdity of desire. These differences matter. Each of these works proposes a theory of colony as concept, of collectivity and desire, of governance and impossibility. Writers from that era did not just foretell failure or succumb to romance and neglect tragedy. They insisted on utopia and commitment, antagonism and introspection. The story of anti-colonialism, whether narrated as romance or as tragedy, continues to focus on a few great men, as I've just done, and often on very selected readings of those figures. However we see them now, heroes, traitors, despots, conscripts of an alien modernity, harbingers of post-colonial melancholy, our turn to these familiar figures perhaps keeps us trapped in circular debates. I'm hoping that in turning now to Lorraine Hansberry, the celebrated young, gifted, and Black author of Raisin in the Sun, a play often misunderstood to her chagrin as advocating liberal integration, I can recognize her as an astute theorist of anti-colonialism. Like Fanon, she also died at the very young age of 34 and was passionately committed to the cause of African liberation. Almost all critics of her play, Les Blancs, have commented on her extraordinarily prophetic vision. She anticipates the future that is to unfold in decolonizing Africa, evincing what Cheryl Higashida calls feminist queer investments in Black national liberation. Nina Simone famously recalled getting a political education from her friend Lorraine. She says, "When we got together, it was always Marx, Lenin, and revolution. Real girls talk." Hansberry's play, drafted by 1966, completed by Robert Nemiroff, was first performed in New York City in 1970 with James Earl Jones as the lead. It gathers many anti-colonial strands of her thinking, variously fostered by her education with Du Bois, her journalistic work with Paul Robeson's magazine Freedom, and her voracious readings of African history and politics, especially through her uncle, William Leo Hansberry's numerous writings on African civilization. And of course, he taught two future African heads of state, Nkrumah and Azikiwe. Hansberry was also galvanized by a visceral reaction to Jean Genet's celebrated play, The Blacks, a Clown Show from 1961, which she termed a conversation between white men about themselves. Set in the fictional country of Zatembe, the action of her play revolves around an isolated hospital come mission at a moment of anti-colonial awakening and the brutal colonial repression of the uprising. The play roughly mimics the historical events surrounding the Mau Mau uprising in colonial Kenya. Kumalo, a hazy Kenyatta-like figure, remains off stage, though rumors of his return from exile proliferate. Hansberry rebuts Genet's absurdist engagement with Black liberation. She saw him as persisting in a kind of romantic racism by setting a Shakespearean tragedy in anti-colonial Africa, thus meeting Scott's criteria of tragedy, but reaching very different conclusions. Not a romance of diaspora, nor a romance of overcoming, nor preoccupied by that familiar question of what is Africa to me, sounded by so many from County Cullen onward, but a clear-eyed look at anti-colonial revolution. The play is incredibly subtle. No character has moral clarity. There are heroes and villains to be sure, but no caricatures. And despite the critical response to the play, so some critics claim that the play boiled down to an advocacy of genocide, Hansberry is also unafraid to cut her Black protagonist to size to imbue the clueless white American journalist with sympathy. She also takes up the legacy of rape and violence across generations and probes questions of homosexuality and racial mixture. She had written elsewhere about the distortion of Kenya's Gikuyu as bloodthirsty terrorists practicing witchcraft by refocusing attention on British land grabs. In the name of civilization and Christianity, she shows how the British brought death, violence, humiliation, and famine. She writes, when the Gikuyu protested, they were ignored. When they resisted, they were slaughtered. Tshembe Matose, the Hamlet-like figure at the center of the play, returns from England for his father's funeral. Torn between his cosmopolitan embrace of his white European wife and child and the demands of his family, he joins the anti-colonial struggle at the end of the play and kills his own brother, who is a convert to the Roman Catholic Church and despises native cultural practices. Just like James presents Toussaint as Hamlet, so does Hansberry. Her kaleidoscopic play insists that colonized Africans can become psychically whole only by joining the revolutionary struggle for freedom. So you can hear the kind of Fanonian imperative here. Although Les Blancs is styled as a Shakespearean tragedy, in contrast to Scott's view, the play maintains a clear sense of agency. History has a purpose, and her protagonist is able to make a moral choice, one that matters. Neither reducible to the nation-building project, nor to the self-authorizing function of anti-colonial autobiographies and fictions by future leaders of decolonized states, nor to the desires named by Bandung, the play focuses less on Aristotle's notion of the tragic flaw in our hero, and more on historical contingencies that generate a series of bad choices. And yet it matters that her hero chooses revolution. So the play troubles how we see the genres of anti-colonial thought in generative ways. It mingles tragedy and romance with prophecy, satire, the oral fable, and farce. Just as Robin Kelly says in his preface to Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism, the play is, quote, not a solution or a strategy or a little red book with pithy quotes. It is a dancing flame in a bonfire. Hansberry's play also benefits from being placed in dialogue with Facing Mount Kenya, published in 1938, where as part of a discussion of the Gikuyu system of land tenure, Jomo Kenyatta tells a story about a hyena. Once upon a time, an elephant made a friendship with a man. In a heavy thunderstorm, the elephant asks the man if he can come into his hut to stay dry. The man agrees. The elephant comes in, flings the man out into the rain, and usurps his hut. The king of the jungle, the lion, sets up an imperial commission of inquiry, made up of many animals, but no men, since no one from the man's side was well enough educated to understand the intricacy of jungle law. Let me cut to the chase. The commission allows the elephant to continue occupying the man's hut and asks the man to find another suitable hut. As soon as he builds another, the rhino takes it over. The story repeats itself with the leopard, the hyena, and the fox. Finally, the man builds a large new hut, which all the animals enter and try to claim as theirs. While they squabble, the man sets the hut on fire, burns it to the ground, and lives happily ever after. Now let's consider how Hansberry rewrites this story, which is clearly an allegory for the European scramble for Africa and the constant refrain that the colonized are not ready for self-government. Modingo, a wise hyena, lives between the land of the elephants and that of the hyenas. The elephants claim more space because of their size. The hyenas resist because, quote, they had been first in that part of the jungle and were accustomed to running free. Modingo, Hamlet-like, deliberates. Yes, brothers, true, we were first in this land, but they do need space. Any fool can see that elephants are very large. And because I was born with the mark of reason on my brow, on which account I am called Modingo, one who thinks carefully before he acts, I cannot join you on our side while there is also justice on the other. While he thinks and thinks, the elephants gather their herds and drive the hyenas out of the jungle altogether. Hansberry writes, that is why the hyena laughs until this day and why it is such terrible laughter, because it was such a bitter joke that was played upon them while they reasoned. If in Kenyatta's hyena story, the genre of the parable bolsters the romance of anti-colonial revolution, Hansberry adapts the tale as an allegory of the Fenonian native intellectual, the one who first chases westernization, then an abstract idea of the primitive native tradition, able to grasp only the outer garments of the people, not the teeming life within. Her play is not scripted around the leader himself, who never appears on stage, and her Hamlet is not a prince. The bitter laughter of her hyena is thus quite similar to the work Scott demands of the tragic mode, albeit shot through with a sense of absurdism. Hansberry rescripts Kenyatta's anti-colonial ethnographic invention of tradition, what Simon Gikandi calls his Afro-Victorian self-authorizing. Instead, writing from the diaspora, Hansberry gives us a window into Pan-African epistemologies, a poetics of anti-colonialism that exceeds the logic of nation building, even as it sidesteps earlier territorial desires of Black imperial fantasies and liberal models of seemingly new world orders that maintain permanent dependency. Such concerns return in a startling way in our own era, as a number of African diaspora novelists today return to what Scott characterized as anachronistic. An attitude of anti-colonial longing, a longing for anti-colonial revolution. Robert Mugabe is perhaps the exemplary instance of the liberation hero turned authoritarian despot, underlining Scott's powerful claim that anti-colonial utopias have gradually withered into post-colonial nightmares. Noviolet Bulawayo's Booker Prize shortlisted 2022 novel Glory sketches a detailed and at times delightful allegory of Mugabe's removal by coup in 2017 as it rewrites George Orwell's Animal Farm for a new century. As we shift from Hansberry and Kenya to Bulawayo and Mugabe, from the dream of revolution to the nightmare of dictatorship, I suggest that the utopian longings of anti-colonialism persist, as Bulawayo reinvents received genres to take us out of the dyad of romance versus tragedy. Tragedy becomes a satire, a riotous farce that seeks to revive a collective, a populist uprising that can imagine a new collectivity into being. The novel also features an animal allegory, but further draws on oral tales, farce, satire, diasporic return narratives, and the lingua franca of the internet, as the cacophony of something like Twitter stands in for the lost national public sphere. Glory conducts an anatomy of Mugabe's dictatorship and fall from power. Bitingly, it takes up the meaning of the failure of national liberation and its perches on Zimbabwe's present. But the novel is unencumbered by exhaustion or by the loss of hope or horizon. Glory teems with philosophies and characters, media and objects, riotously mingling history and fable, satire and salvage. The novel doesn't even seem nostalgic in any simple fashion. The notes of tragicomedy, the turn to the grotesque, and the ribald are perhaps nowhere better captured than in Bulawayo's incorporation of the rhythms of internet speech. For instance, one vignette in the novel captures hilarious responses from Zimbabwean citizens and expats to tweets from POTUS at Big Baboon of the US, who cannot even spell dictatorship properly. These tweets undercut any pretense the West could have of suggesting that authoritarian rule is the inevitable destiny of the post-colony and juxtapose democratic governance as the desired alternative. It also allows the public to respond in real time with hashtags like Never a Colony Again and remind Trump, who is the would-be dictator trying to copy his successful African counterpart, that he tweets from stolen land. Both nations are thus undressed in any pretense of legitimate governance, moral authority, or democratic rule. But the conversation also very easily and quickly departs from the US and devolves into internal disagreements among thinly disguised supporters of Mugabe and his successor, Mnangagwa. Mugabe is styled as an old horse, plagued by dementia, while his successor is given the name of General Tuvi, a play on the word for shit, also re-signifying Trump's shithole country's comment. While these authoritarian rulers justify their reigns of terror by saying, "Show me a nation that was born without blood," Bulawayo refuses to concede the terrain to them. Instead of a wholesale dismissal of the nation as a category, the novel dissociates the corrupt leaders from what it recuperates as the space of the national popular. I think Mark might be happy with this move. The elite, including dictators and military leaders, have captured the nation state for sure, and the novel energetically undermines and exposes their pretense to glory. Dressing them down as dogs, donkeys, cows, cats, ducks, horses, and goats, the novel uses exaggeration, farce, and surrealism to highlight the dysfunction and trauma caused by Mugabe and his defenders. So I see it very much as in sympathy with these kinds of political cartoons, which are very well known. Grace Mugabe, for example, picks up the phone and orders a PhD to become Dr. Sweet Mother from the highest ranked university in Jeddah, as if she's ordering from a KFC drive-thru, though the degree is indeed cheaper. We not only have a minister of revolution, but also a minister of corruption, minister of homophobic affairs, minister of disinformation, and minister of looting. A chapter called Past, Present, Future, Past, with future crossed out, underlines the cyclical nature of a dystopian history, one which makes any conventional realist plotting untenable. In contrast, the chorus of the novel serves as the voice of we the people of Jeddah. They are neither uncritically romanticized nor dismissed as naive. Rather, the reader watches their political education as they navigate the wreckage of decades of authoritarian rule and the political chaos that ensues, even as nominally elections are held. They begin with the claim that us Jeddahans are in our nature peaceful animals, but the crushed hopes, betrayed dreams, and the broken promise of independence changes them. When Mugabe is deposed in a coup, they feel like they're being robbed of their starring role in the movie of their life. but their complicated joy gathers the memories of all who've been lost and killed and exiled as they gloat that, after all, leadership is not sexually transmitted and pose for selfies with soldiers on these liberated streets. Nature itself responds to this chorus. When elections promise a new day, flowers bloom everywhere in the land. When Tuvi usurps power, people realize that change is an illusion. We shriek, we roar, we charge, we are a mad, writhing sea roaring. The brutal crushing of rebellion and protest leads to, quote, wounded flesh, blood in the streets, blood in the gutters, screams. Up in the sky, clouds turn the color of bruises, and the air so hot, so thick with tear gas, we cannot see, we cannot breathe. And this is, of course, a clear call to Eric Garner and the protests that followed in the African-American context, which is something that Bulawayo is really interested in and takes up in her first novel, We Need New Names. Bulawayo's recuperation of the space of the national popular is also visible in the debates women have when Destiny the goat, the wanderer, returns from exile only to learn that returning is one thing and arriving is quite another. Her dialogue with women who reflect on their service in war leads to the memory of a past before Jidada was Jidada. Past that, quote, back when rocks were so soft, you could pinch them and draw blood, when mountains were still growing, when gods roamed the earth, that past of long, long, long before greedy colonists came with guns, divided the earth among themselves like there was nobody on it already, flew strange rags in the air called flags, and said, let there be countries. So here we see a clear desire to get out of the world order based on nation states. And yet the novel ends with the fantasy that dictators will go to hell, that the military and the police will simply lay down their arms and join the people. We even witness the creation of a new flag, signaling peace and integrity, memory of the past, and hope for the future. The new national anthem, at least in my reading, is presented earnestly and not with any irony. So Bulawayo writes, it's an anthem that spoke of the kind of glory that burns eternal and glows with living light. This ending sits a bit uneasily with what we've learned thus far. The bodies of both mother and daughter, who bear the scars from 1983 and from 2008 as an archive of the seat of power's cruelty, continue to resonate. So we can see here that in this, and I'm just cutting a little bit, but the central, what we could call a central character, Destiny the goat, ultimately becomes a martyr as she is shot when she's reading out a book that she's written. So she becomes a martyr to the cause. So we can see that the novel refuses what is perhaps a reflexive rhetorical move in a lot of recent scholarship in border studies, a call to abolish the nation state and advocate for open borders, which is in some ways the logical conclusion of this exploration. That the novel marks closure precisely by returning to the very symbols, the flag, the anthem, the martyred body, that attended the first moment of national liberation demands further debate. Does the ending simply return to the diagnosis offered some 40, 50 years ago by Benedict Anderson about the need for symbols like the tomb of the unknown soldier or the burning flame, symbols that consecrate the peculiar joining of love and death in the figure of the nation? In other words, does the slain body of Destiny and her recovered history, so presumably the book she writes is also the novel we're reading, does this simply update the symbol at the center, but not displace the schema that keeps this world order based on nations and borders in place? How then might we read the call voiced by the chorus, we need a new world order? Is the novel unable to envision such a new world order? In Scott's terms, could we say that the novel acknowledges the tragedy of post-colonial failure, but reactivates the romance of the nation? And this is something that I'm seeing in a number of novels, not just Glory from this era. They're quite different from Bulawayo, but all of them exhibit this desire to recreate the space of collective struggle and to recover historical memory in what seems like the same way as before. Do we then follow Bulawayo in her turn to the reimagined anthem and flag? Surely, no matter how the valence of nationalism has been misconstrued, we cannot simply return to the outdated vocabulary, especially when it has already been hijacked by post-colonial despots, or what Olufemi Taiwo in another context terms elite capture. Are we then simply doomed to misty nostalgia for the days of racial world-making and dreams of liberation? Or do contemporary forms of the making and unmaking of citizenship across the world require us to shift our scales of analysis and rethink the nation and its alternatives in a meaningful way. The question is particularly thorny because Mugabe's power rested also in his ability to hijack the language of anti-imperialism. In the novel, The Old Horse Rants and Raves, and this is a long quote from the novel, what would that USA be without the stolen land it now has the audacity to cordon off with a violent border? What indeed would that country be without the looted sons and daughters of Africa it now keeps in abject poverty when they themselves birthed the country's wealth? Touching on colonialism's ongoing exploitation of Africa's natural resources, gold, diamonds, platinum, tobacco, rubber, tea, coffee, calling for the repatriation of stolen objects in Western museums, the father of the nation thus denounces the West in a long list for neocolonialism, for capitalism, for racism, for economic sanctions, for ugly trade practices. So far, it kind of sounds like us, but we go on. For the brain drain, for homosexuals, for the power cuts and the water cuts, for the potholes on the roads and the unpicked trash on the streets, for the defeat of the Jeddah national soccer team at the recent continental finals, for the dearth of production of existing works by local poets and writers. So this is obviously meant to be ludicrous, right? You can see the strategic positioning of the local poets and writers at the end. It's very possible I'm just missing the joke. But I wonder what it means for us to reckon with Mugabe's platform of repatriating land to Black Zimbabweans that in the end became one of the causes of his long-awaited downfall and led to some very difficult moments in the Africanist scholarly community in terms of how to assess the meaning of his actions. The novel thus asks us to think about the challenge of articulating a language of liberation when it has been hijacked and tainted, that the nation is no longer the locus of utopian hopes is a given today. Does this mean that the long history of theorizing the nation as political form in post-colonial thought, we could think of Frederick Jameson on Third World literature, Anderson on the modularity of the nation form, or Partha Chatterjee on its derivativeness, should this now give way to the sole narrative about the nation as a form always already destined for fascism, as recent history so often insinuates? How else might we rethink forms of collectivity outside the nation state? Our efforts to rethink prophecies or anatomies of failed states and failed genres may be revived, I'm suggesting, by the challenging theorization of nations and nationalism in these varied works by Hansberry and Bulawayo. Both writers do not claim any kind of organic relation to the masses, but both in their feminist explorations perhaps take us to something we might call unimagined communities, theorized in exile and diaspora in the Black Atlantic world, motivated by something other than an easy cynicism or a complacent liberalism that leaves no room for most of the world's populations. Scott's caution about the heroic register that often attends our histories of liberation also asks us to turn to what I might call unheroic forms, the tragic play shot through with the romance of revolution in African oral culture, the novel as farce that tries to take the pulse of the moment, to try and theorize what it means for us to say that both a genre and a political form have become exhausted, have failed, and can no longer express the collective yearnings of a people. Thinking further about the grip of narratives of failure on our imagination, about revolutions not just as ruptures, but as endless processes of reinvention and remaking, and pondering forms of political life outside the state might thus help not only generate a more accurate portrayal of decolonization and its relation to radical thought, but also force us to confront the stakes of associating the post-colony with failure. Thank you.
Your wonderful speech that covers a lot of historical period and a lot of historical genres that are dealing with some dilemmas that we are now facing in so-called post-colonial era. So I would like to get some questions or comments or challenges from the crowd. Oh, thank you, Professor Inji.
I have just a short question, but the answer might be more complicated and simple. I'm wondering if you can find a certain connectedness or connectivity between the African American Black Atlantic and European African Atlantic. I mean, it's a, we are now talking about the certain Black Germans who were victimized by the Holocaust, right? And how can we find a certain connectedness or clue of memory that the connecting those experiences of the slavery trade between Africa and America Europe, and Africa is triangle, a genocidal atrocities.
That's a really wonderful question. Thank you, Professor Lim. We were both at a conference on Holocaust memory recently at UCLA, where we were thinking about some of these same questions. And I guess I would say that, so the short answer is yes. That's a wonderful opening for thinking through some of these ideas about what collectivities and what new political forms are possible, right, that are beyond the existing ones that have become contaminated. So I guess I would say that I would want to keep both of those historical scenes in play, right? So the mid-20th century, where you do see this kind of Pan-African effort take shape, and it's US folks, it's Black British folks, it's Caribbean, it's people who are traveling across the Atlantic world and elsewhere, trying to forge an idea of both of revolution and of that belated entry into modernity that Gilroy talks about in ways that would be conjoined, right? So that's kind of the first mid-century moment that I think is showing us what you're asking for, that absolutely takes place. So like 1945, right? The Pan-African Conference, we could think of that as a particular kind of moment. To my mind, some of that, it goes through so many different, that utopian desire gets kind of kicked around so much by history as it unfolds over the next 5 or 6 decades, that to me it seems like today, if we were to try and articulate that, it's relatively easy to do, like as a problem for thought. I don't think that's a very difficult thing to do. But if you try and do it in the same way, where it would actually result in some kind of actual political form, I think it becomes much more complicated, because there's so many, the different nation states are in play. There's different kinds of politics around questions of restitution, for example, or reparations in different national contexts. It's very different what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the United States, what's happening in a place like Ghana, for example, which has a UNESCO kind of sponsored, slave memory, but has other kinds of problems, right? So I think it gets really hard to imagine that kind of political form in the present. And what I'm interested in these novels that I'm looking at in the present is that I think they're grasping for precisely what you're asking for, right? So they're looking for a way to articulate that. And one of the things that they do is they go back to that earlier language of revolution, but we haven't really dealt with what it means that those earlier visions failed, right? So it's kind of a weird return that isn't quite reckoning with what all of it meant. I guess that's sort of the claim that I'm making.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. Can you share with us a bit more about the differences among all these novels? Well, you cover do they feel all the same? Because Africa is such a huge continent,
Right.
And I guess from different regions, the East Africa and Southern Africa would be quite different. Even though I'm not a specialist,
Right.
And in terms of genres, you only focus on novel. And what about the other genres? Poetry, would there a case felt better case than just fell entirely?
So those are two excellent questions again. And let me take the second one first. So, and I fully sort of, again, the short answer is yes. The other genres are doing complicated work that I am not getting at here, right? Because I am focusing on the novel in particular. And that's something that I think about quite a lot. But I come back to the novel in this context precisely because it's what I said about George Lamming, right? There's such a history in the post-colonial context of linking the novel as a form with the creation of a liberated subjectivity. That it's really hard for me to get away from the novel as a form, though of course, in some ways, Glory, the novel that I talked about, on the one hand, it's a novel that really wants to be a play. That's very clear to me. And that's why I put it together with Hansberry, right? There's a chorus, there's all this stuff happening. If people haven't read the novel, there's two other things that I'll say about it, just to give you a sense of how playful it is and how it's not a conventional novel. So there's it's my favorite scene in the novel where the figure of the dictator is having a conversation with Siri and asking her basically how to become a better dictator, right? So it's like, Siri, tell me how I can control everyone's movements and everyone's minds. And so she's like, you mean become a better dictator? So she's trying to do something interesting with what's happening in kind of social media and thinking about how it comes into this very traditional form of the novel, which maybe can't do what you're asking it to do, right? So that's kind of the sort of a quick response to what you're asking, that we have these received forms, they embed a particular kind of history. So it's hard, I think, for both for critics and for writers to get away from them, though maybe much more is possible with other genres, right? Like documentary fiction, like documentaries, music, right? All kinds of other stuff. The first question that you asked, I think the novels that I'm looking at, they fail in quite different ways. And I'm not even sure that I would say that they all fail, but they make us think about failure in useful and challenging ways, right? Beyond kind of despair. They're not, so none of them, I would say what combines them is that none of them are very cynical, right? So this is sort of so it's kind of a trend that I am seeing in contemporary African fiction, often fiction that might be published in the United States or in Europe, but is celebrated on the continent as well, right? So someone like Maza Mengiste is maybe a good example of this, because she's very, she's obviously a diasporic author, but her work is so deeply embedded in Ethiopia and Ethiopian history. So that's kind of her anchor. And she's trying to create this kind of sense of historical memory that she thinks has not yet taken place. So it's almost this sense that she's trying to play catch up, right? So for other countries, like for Nigeria, for example, for South Africa, certainly, we already have this whole body of literature from the 60s and the 70s and the 80s that has achieved this work. And so you have writers from some of the other countries that don't have those long Anglophone traditions, or at least more visible Anglophone traditions, who are kind of trying to go back to that, right? So Cameroon, that's another example. Mbolo, the kind of Cameroonian American author who was, again, very successful, picked by Oprah for her book club and so on, is kind of returning to this language of revolution that we saw in like Ngugi's novels from the 60s and the 70s, which are based in Kenya. In this kind of weird way that I'm identifying. I hope that addresses your question a little bit.
So I think the time is up. So even though there may be some other questions, I think we need to stop here. So thank you for your wonderful speech. I think when I first, read the title of her speech, I thought about a little bit pessimistic. But after hearing your speech, then we should be duped to the word failure, but we are confronting the failure in a very differently and thinking about going over there. So I think it makes us hope for thinking about the failure a different way. Thank you for your wonderful presentation.